Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring birthmarks and physical signs of reincarnation. With me is Dr. James Matlock, who is co-author with Erlander Haraldson of the recently published book, I Saw a Light and Came Here, Children's Experiences of Reincarnation. He is an anthropologist who has published dozens of academic papers related to reincarnation, parapsychology, and anthropology. He has also authored a course, an academic course called Signs of Reincarnation, and he is a regular contributor to the Psi Encyclopedia, sponsored by the Society for Psychical Research in England. Welcome, Jim.
Good to be here, Jeff.
It's a pleasure to be with you once again. And we're getting into some of the most dramatic material that there is in support of reincarnation. And probably many of our viewers have heard that the birthmarks found in children who remember past lives often correspond to the death wounds of the previous person. That's just about as dramatic as it gets, I suppose.
Yes, I think so. In fact, and it's quite true. I mean, many birthmarks do seem to correspond to death wounds. In fact, Ian Stevenson, who pioneered the research on reincarnation with children, on children's past life memories, wrote quite a huge 2-volume book on birthmarks and birth defects relating to reincarnation.
So there's extensive literature on that, but there's also a wide variety of other physical signs of reincarnation that we're going to review now.
Okay, good. Yes, because there are. You're right. It's not just birthmarks that show up. Apparently corresponding to.
It's a wide, very wide variety, which suggests that these things are, I'm going to say, psychologically motivated.
I believe so. Yes. Yeah.
We're not looking at something that's mechanistic.
Right. We're not looking at something that's mechanistic. There doesn't seem to be anything like a subtle body or something on which wounds or other scars are automatically impressed and which automatically carry it forward. There does seem to be something psychosomatic there. The mind does seem to get involved somehow with the transmission.
So. And the birthmarks need not be related to death wounds. They could be related to other birthmarks or...
That's right. Other birthmarks, other times scars, surgical scars, even tattoos.
Something that would be meaningful to the personality that's moving from body to body.
Precisely. Yeah, and that's key, I believe, something that's meaningful. And anything, really, that's psychologically meaningful to the previous person, it can show up as a birthmark, or as we'll talk about, birth defects also, but can be transmitted forward in that way.
And you even have, in our previous discussion off camera, you mentioned it could be a propensity for a certain illness. If the previous person died of a particular illness, that can carry forward.
That's right. Internal diseases as well. So it's just a variety of physical things. That's why I prefer to say physical signs of reincarnation and, get us away from simply the birthmarks.
Well, there's a lot of popular opinion concerning the fact that, or the notion that people will look the same from lifetime to lifetime.
Right.
That's one of the most obvious things, I suppose, the average layperson or viewer of our program would want to pay attention to, I would think.
I probably. It has become very ingrained in the popular
it can
idea
be a
of
little
reincarnation.
deceptive because so many people can resemble each other if you get the right angles.
Yes. One has to be very careful about using facial resemblances in particular as identifying traits.
Especially relying on it.
They can be present, but one should start with the other things that we've been talking about, the memories, the behaviors, and only if there is an identification with the person who lived before, a previous person, based on them, should then one look towards the physical things. Now, birthmarks can be very specific, and physical deformities and the internal diseases, they can be very specific, so they can be evidential. But simply, facial characteristics alone, they're not unique. I mean, we're all human beings, and we're not that different. So there has to be something very distinctive about the facial characteristic. And there can be. For instance, in what we call international cases, which are relatively unusual, that is, where the previous person was born, the previous person died in one country, and the subject of the case who calls that person's life was born in another country, the subject can have characteristics of the other country, and if the ethnicity is different, let's say if the subject is born in Asia and is remembering the life of someone who lived and died in Europe, they may have European characteristics like eye forms of a European shape rather than the typical Asian, and so forth.
Well, it would seem to me that as a researcher, one of the problems with looking at physical characteristics in general is that the way the case studies are accumulated and analyzed, I get the impression it's practically all based on a post-hoc analysis. You get the story of the person, you notice the birthmarks, and then you kind of fit the story together with whatever physical signs you observe. And it makes sense. You have a coherent story that's unique to that case, but it's pretty much all generated post-hoc.
Generally, but not necessarily. And this is one area in which the whole subject of birthmarks and birth defects becomes very interesting.
Yes.
Because in some cultures, particularly in Native American cultures and tribal cultures, more generally, there's not the idea that karma or some force like that is going to determine where one is reborn. There's the possibility of a person themselves choosing where to be reborn and to be reborn. And where that idea is present in the culture, there's also the idea that one can control things about
the experimental birthmark method.
We'll get to those, but let me say something before that.
Okay.
And that is, I'm talking about what we call planned reincarnation.
Yes.
Which is where people will say, before they die, that they intend to be reborn in such and such a family, and sometimes with such and such characteristics. So in one Tlingit case that Ian Stevenson studied... The
Tlingit are natives of Alaska.
Of Alaska, that's right. A man who had prominent surgical scars told his, I believe it was his granddaughter, that he would come back to her and he would be recognized by birthmarks matching these surgical scars. And in fact, a baby was born to her with a birthmark looking exactly like a surgical scar, including the stitch marks around the central wound there.
So one could say that's not post-hoc.
That's not post-hoc. And there's an even more dramatic case from the same area, Haida Indians, who live slightly north of the Tlingit in British Columbia. A fisherman was very weary of the strenuousness of being a fisherman, casting nets out and drawing them in, and told several people before he died. He died an accidental death, but told several people that when he was reborn, that he wanted not to have his left hand, so that he wouldn't have to work so hard. So he wouldn't have to be a fisherman again. He wouldn't have to work so hard.
Because he expected, I assume, to be born and reborn in that culture.
In that culture, that's right.
Yeah,
and
where everybody's a fisherman.
That's right. And in these cultures, there's also the idea, in addition, that one will be born in family lines in order to receive again names, rights, privileges, pick up, in a sense, where one left off.
Yes.
But he didn't want to be a fisherman again. So it would have been his granddaughter, who was pregnant at the time, 2 months pregnant. A baby was born to her in term with a missing out of his arm. And on that basis identified as this man. He also had a phobia of water. He never grew up to speak about his life. I guess the birthmark was enough of an indication of who he was, the birth defect in his case. And he spent his life in clerical positions rather than.
So in other words, he was born so deformed that he couldn't possibly have worked as a fisherman.
That's right, and he got his wish.
But he didn't have the memories of the previous person.
No, he didn't.
And in that culture, that wasn't necessarily essential.
No. In these, particularly in Northwest North America, they look at particular signs like birthmarks. They're very attuned to birthmarks and birth defects as identifying marks.
So there's a sense in which the Indians of the Northwest in North America, they're almost like the Tibetans in the way they plan for incarnations.
That's right. But they're even more precise than they are, which is quite interesting. The Tibetans, many of them, the lamas, will say that they're going to be reborn in such and such a place, but they don't tell you exactly where. They give you clues, but then you have to follow up those clues and you have to hunt for them.
And the Tibetans aren't so focused on physical markings, I presume.
No, they turn up there, but they're not so much, they put more reliance on recognitions of objects and so forth.
Yeah, but the Northwest Indians really do focus in on birthmarks.
On birthmarks.
Now let's talk about the experimental birthmarks. This is one of the most interesting features of the reincarnation literature.
It is, and this is, again, is something that's not so easy to explain away. Experimental birthmarks are marks that are put on a body close to death or shortly after death even, by members of the family typically, with the intention, with the purpose of following that person into its next
They may like take a piece of charcoal or something and mark the body.
Or sit from a cooking pot. This is another standard one. And this practice is found throughout Asia. And or throughout mainland, Asia, and quite far back in time. We have some Chinese cases from early in the first millennium, right?
Oh my!
Second or third century, right? With experimental birthmarks.
And so the idea is that some relative who has access to the body will mark it in a particular location.
That's correct.
With a particular design or.
Often, sometimes it's just a mark.
So just a mark.
A mark. And other times, it can be more elaborate. Particularly, it's just a small mark. And birthmarks show up in the same location, typically with the same coloring. There is one Thai case where a lipstick tube was used to mark the back of the neck, and the child was born with a red circular mark on the back of the neck.
Now, in these cases, they don't necessarily, do they expect the child to be born in the same family?
No, not necessarily. They just, and we don't really know, though, then how many experimental birthmarks are attempted. And then, unless a child is born in in the same family or close by, or becomes known to the previous person's family, there's no way to verify it.
So typically what we're talking about here, again, is the young child has memories of a previous lifetime. The child has birthmarks, and then researchers discover after the fact that the previous person's body had been marked.
Right. Well, typically, it's not the researchers. By the time the researchers come along, the families have already made the connection.
Yeah.
But there, and in some cases, with the reincarnation in the same family, the mothers, know about the birth, about the experimental marks.
Or if it's in a village, it might be known.
It might be known. But when the mother is aware of it, the idea is put out that they could be due to what is called maternal impression.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that the mother is somehow influencing the child in her womb to have this mark.
If the mother knew in advance.
If the mother knew in advance.
Yeah, because in this case, the previous person is already dead.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's not necessarily a psychological motive of the previous person to cause such a birth.
It could be. But
assuming that the dead person has some consciousness, which is of course implicit in reincarnation.
Right. Well, remember many of these cases, the experimental mark is made before the person dies, before the person has lost consciousness.
I see.
In a minority of cases, it's after they've lost consciousness. And when it's after they've lost consciousness, yes, you have to suppose that the spirit is still somehow around, is still able, is still consciously aware, and is still able to take that in and then reproduce it. But there are a number of cases where the mother was not aware that the mark had been made at all. And in those cases, and those are more evidential, obviously.
Right,
because
you can't attribute that to maternal impression.
Unless you bring in our old bugaboo of super psi again. You have to say that the mother became aware psychically that this was done, and then used her powers to imprint this on the child.
That's a stretch, I would say.
I believe it is, particularly when the children then proceed to have behaviors or talk about that person's life. It becomes rather a stretch. Nevertheless, there are people who suggest this.
Well, in addition to birthmarks, you've got other physical signs.
That's right. I mean, I mentioned one, birth defect.
Birth defects.
Deformity. And
we talked about propensities for certain illnesses. Do you have any examples of that?
Well, one would be a case that I mentioned in one of our earlier conversations. Christian Haupt, an American boy who believes that he was Lou Gehrig, the baseball player before, and has been something of a prodigy with baseball. Now, Lou Gehrig, of course, died from ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. And the child, fortunately, hasn't shown any symptoms of Lou Gehrig's disease. But one of the characteristic secondary illnesses which goes along with Lou Gehrig's is upper respiratory infections. And the child has severe cases of asthma.
I see.
So that would be an example if he was Lou Gehrig before, and he has there's other evidence backing that up. It suggests that he truly was. Then this would be an example of an internal disease carrying over, and it's somewhat like the death wounds being reproduced. It's an internal disease at death, which is then reappears.
So what you're saying is people who are born with a certain susceptibility,
right? Exactly,
may well have acquired that from a previous lifetime.
That's right. Yes.
Now, I think it's useful to discuss the question of physical resemblance a little further. You and I were conversing earlier, and you mentioned that there's one very striking case where there seems to be the opposite of a physical resemblance, that the child was born into a family where I guess it was the grandparent ought to have had some, genetic connection with the grandparent, but looked nothing like that person.
Yes, this is a very interesting case, and it just goes to show that we can't rely on physical resemblance alone, because it's not always present. This is a case of a boy who appears to have been his grandfather, his mother's father,
Yes.
reincarnated. And what is interesting about it, psychologically, is that his mother's father had sexually abused her throughout her teenage years. They were estranged later on, but he apparently continued to be obsessed with her, and then was reborn as her child. His death occurred only 10 days before his conception, and his date of conception is known in this case.
And the child had memories of having been the grandfather?
Not extensive
Not
memories.
directly.
Not extensive memories. He did say one thing which suggested to the mother that's who he was.
Yeah.
But he had quite an array of behaviors that suggested that. The father had died of, the mother's father had died of lung cancer.
Yes.
And the child was very opposed to smoking. From a young age, he would go up to people and tell them not to smoke, that smoking was bad for their health, that it could give them cancer even, he said at one point.
And as I recall, you mentioned he even kept telling his mother, I'm sorry, as if he was apologizing, for the sexual abuse of her father.
Right, and she found that very significant, and it allowed them to heal that relationship, because she still was very traumatized by it.
Sure.
And but once she got over the idea that he had returned as her child of all things, that relationship allowed that all to heal.
So the psychological motive for the child to look so different from his grandfather would be that he didn't want to shock the mother.
He did not want her to know that he had returned. We can say, perhaps. So somehow he managed to direct the influence, away from.
Presumably.
We can hypothesize. It managed to direct the physical influence away.
This would be an example of a post-hoc analysis.
It would be, but we can say that, and it's particularly interesting because it's in the same family, where you would expect a genetic relationship.
Right.
You would expect, but the boy looks quite different from his grandfather.
And in the way you tell the story, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I mean, so if we interpret this case in the way that it seems to invite interpretation. Yes, the father was obsessed with his daughter, continued to be obsessed with his daughter until his death, determined to come back as her child, but didn't want her to know. And so instead of imprinting the body with marks that would allow him to be identified, avoided all possible identifying traits. But it just goes to show that you can't rely on physical likeness alone in making identifications.
Well, because your hypothesis, which seems like a very good one, is all of these things are mediated psychologically.
That's right. Yes.
And so one has to understand the psychology of the previous personality.
Not just the subject. I mean, there are critics who want to look just at the subject's psychology, and I believe we have another conversation coming up on the psychology of past life memory, where we can explore that in more detail. But there are some critics who want to look just at the psychology of the subject of the case, with the idea that the subject then is reaching out through extrasensory perception, through psi, to draw in this information and mobilize it in terms of behaviors and things. But no, we have to look not only at the subject, but also at the previous person. So yes, you're quite right. I mean, this would be an example of where it's very important to take the previous person's psychology into account.
Yeah. Now, are there other physical signs that we should be considering? I know that at one point we talked about the potential for genetic markers. Or I should say, that's what critics sometimes...
Right. Yes, I think you're thinking about the idea of genetic inheritance that we can. I mean, this gets into how we interpret this. And it's something that has to be ruled out in explaining the transmission of birthmarks and birth defects. Can there be a genetic transmission of them? Well, perhaps there can be in certain cases where there's a family linkage, but in many cases there's no genetic relationship. There's no biological relationship between the lives, and genetic explanations, genetic inheritance becomes rather strained as an explanation in those cases.
Oh, okay, and I know there's also an issue we discussed earlier regarding the interval between lifetimes and how that affects the ability of the incarnating spirit or soul or consciousness to influence the development of a fetus, because the human is pretty much fully formed by about 3 months.
Yes, this is a very interesting issue. Well, I mentioned earlier in the case of the Haida men, who the fisherman who did not want to be a fisherman again, and therefore wanted to
born with a birth defect.
That he was born only 7 months after the man's death. The boy was born only 7 months, so there was only a 2-month period there. So obviously the body.
In other words, when you say 2-month period, what you mean is that the spirit of the previous person couldn't have entered the body of the developing fetus until it was at least 2 months old.
That's right. There's a 2-month period between the death of the fisherman and
the conception of the.
Well, the conception occurred 2 months before the death of the fisherman. So the body was already gestating in the womb for 2 months before the spirit of the fisherman joined the body. That's interesting because it shows that that the influence doesn't require the full 9 months gestation. Now, biologically, the body is not really fully formed physically. I mean, the physical features of the body until about 3 months, until the end of the first trimester. So that we see such a major birth defect earlier on sort of fits with that. What is interesting is that we don't see these sorts of major birth defects with intermissions that are shorter than that.
Shorter than,
say, 6 months.
6 months.
Occurring in the second or third trimester.
In other words, if I died and it's my intention that I'm going to be born with a birth defect for whatever reason, I better enter the body of the fetus that I'm going to possess before it's 3 months old, or I won't have that opportunity. Although you did mention one case that was almost instantaneous.
Yes, the intermissions can be very short. There was one case, a Turkish case, where the intermission was only 2 or 3 days. It's not certain exactly when the person died, but it's known, it was 2 or 3 days before the child was born. And the child was born with birthmarks. The man suicided, shot himself through the chin, and the boy was born with an open wound on his chin that was actually oozing pus at the time of birth, and another birthmark on the skull, marking the exit wound of the bullet. And this actually. With bullet wounds, we often see both entry and exit wounds.
This is a case that in which the death occurred days before the birth of the child,
and yet you saw a birth defect, but not a major one, not a fairly minor
not like
one.
a deformity,
not like a deformity, right? And yet it was a physical mark and a physical defect, not just a birthmark, but actually an open scar.
Which suggests that the possessing spirit had the ability to exert a psychokinetic influence on the developing fetus.
Precisely, and I think that's how it works.
Yeah.
So it's psychogenetic, but the process is actually psychokinetic, PK.
Yeah.
And just as there's a great deal of evidence for ESP, there's a great deal of evidence for PK from the lab and from spontaneous cases.
Right.
And so it's really not such a stretch. And we also have good evidence of the potential of the mind to influence the body, say in psychic healing.
Yes.
So it's really not such a stretch to push that back, then, is it, to the beginning of life in the body. You just have to suppose that the spirit at that stage has enough self-awareness, or there's enough of a process. Perhaps it's a subconscious process too.
Yeah.
We don't really know. It doesn't have to be conscious necessarily, but we need to allow for the mind-body to influence to occur from the beginning.
Now, I should just let our viewers know that they ought to pay attention to the program listings, because we intend to do a separate interview just talking about the theory of reincarnation.
Yes, we will.
I know people who are listening at this point, some of them may be thinking, boy, he sure has bought into the whole...
When I first started reading in this area, in the early 1980s, I was put off by this, and many viewers may be too.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole idea of birthmarks and birth defects being associated with a death wound or a physical feature of the previous person, it was hard for me to accept. And at first, when I was reading 20 Cases, Suggestive Reincarnation, as a matter of fact,
Stevenson's
classic book, I just skimmed over all of the birthmarks. I mean, and it came up in other places. I would just skim over that. I was looking for other kinds of evidence, and it was only after I became comfortable with the whole idea that I started taking them more seriously, and then trying to figure out how could that possibly be. Interesting, Stevenson went through a similar sort of process. Initially, he wasn't expecting to find these birthmarks and birth defects. And when he went to India, he also just dismissed them, accounts of them. And it was actually the Tlingit Indians when he went to study them. And he has 7 Tlingit cases and 20 cases. It was the Tlingit who introduced him to the importance of birthmarks.
It's an important part of their folklore. But I regard these birthmarks, as we're discussing them, as examples of macro-psychokinesis. And macro-psychokinesis has always created a lot of resistance, even in the parapsychology community.
Yes, the idea of it. The idea that the mind can do more than simply transfer thoughts or pick up impressions, but that it can actually act on the body or on the physical world,
and not just in microscopic ways, but in very visible ways. Well, Dr. James Matlock, once again, we've had a fascinating discussion about a very important topic. Important because the research is so substantial in this area and so significant for our understanding of this mysterious process of reincarnation.
And yet so little known. It really needs to be much better known.
Thank you so much for sharing with me.
Well, I'm very glad to be here.
And thank you for being with us.